The sound cracked through the hall before anyone understood what had happened. Elena Voss felt the sting first, then the heat, then the silence. 300 pack members stood frozen around her, their eyes wide, their breath caught in their throats. Her cheek burned where Cade Thornwood's hand had landed, and for a moment, she could not feel anything else in the world. Cade stood in front of her, chest rising and falling, his eyes dark with a fury that did not belong to the man she had loved for 3 years. Behind him, half hidden by his broad shoulders, stood Ivy, her younger sister, tears streaming down her face in perfect, practiced rivers. Ivy's hands were pressed to her chest, her lips trembling, playing the part of the wounded girl so well that even Elena, who knew every trick her sister owned, almost believed it herself. "You humiliated her," Cade said, his voice low and shaking. "In front of everyone, on the night of her presentation. How could you do that to your own sister?" Elena opened her mouth, but no words came. She had not done anything. She had not said a single unkind word to Ivy that evening. She had simply stood near the ceremony platform, waiting for her own turn to greet the visiting alphas, when Ivy had suddenly burst into tears and claimed that Elena pushed her aside, that Elena told her she did not deserve a place among the pack's honored guests. It was a lie. It had always been a lie. But lies wrapped in tears were louder than truth spoken in silence. She touched her cheek slowly, feeling the heat spread beneath her fingers. Around her, the pack members exchanged glances. Some looked away in discomfort. Others watched with open curiosity, waiting to see what the rejected sister would do now that the golden couple's cracks had finally split into public view. Elena had spent 3 years smoothing over these cracks, telling herself that love meant patience, that being mates meant looking past small unfairness for the sake of something larger. But there was nothing small about what had just happened. "Cade," she said quietly, and her voice did not shake the way she expected it to. "I did not touch her. I did not say a word to her tonight." "Don't lie to me," Cade snapped. "Not after what you did." Ivy let out another soft sob, burying her face against Cade's arm as though she could not bear to look at her own sister. It was such a small gesture, but it worked exactly as it always had. Elena watched Cade's arm curl protectively around Ivy's shoulders, the same arm that, moments ago, had struck across her own face. She felt something inside her chest go very still, like a lake freezing over in a single night. She thought of all the times before this one, the way Cade always believed Ivy's version of events, no matter how many holes existed in her stories, the way pack meetings always seemed to bend around Ivy's convenience, the way Elena had learned, slowly and painfully, to stop defending herself, because defending herself only made her look guiltier in Cade's eyes. She had told herself this was simply how mated pairs worked out their difficulties. She had told herself that love required sacrifice. She had told herself so many things to survive these 3 years, and every one of them dissolved in an instant, standing there with her cheek still burning, and 300 witnesses watching her world collapse. "Say something," Cade demanded, stepping closer. "Apologize to her." Elena lifted her chin. She looked past him, at Ivy's face, and for one brief moment their eyes met. There was no grief in her sister's expression, no genuine sorrow. There was only a flicker of triumph, quickly hidden beneath another practiced sob. That flicker told Elena everything she needed to know. Her sister had wanted this. Her sister had planned this, or something close enough to it, because Ivy had never once, in all their years growing up together, cried without a reason that served her. "No," Elena said. The single word landed heavier than the slap had. Cade blinked, as though he had not expected refusal from the woman who had spent 3 years bending herself smaller and smaller to fit inside his patience. "What did you say?" "I said no," Elena repeated, and this time her voice carried through the hall, clear and steady. "I will not apologize for something I did not do. I have spent 3 years apologizing for things I never did, comforting a sister who has never once needed comforting, and standing quietly while you chose her voice over mine, again and again. Tonight, in front of everyone, you struck me because she cried. You did not ask me what happened. You did not wait to hear my side. You simply believed her, the way you always believe her, and you hurt me for it." A ripple moved through the crowd, murmurs rising and falling like wind through tall grass. Cade's jaw tightened. his eyes flicking toward the elders who stood near the ceremony platform, aware suddenly that this was no longer a private matter between mates. It was happening in front of the entire pack, in front of visiting alphas from 3 neighboring territories, in front of everyone whose respect he had worked years to earn. "Elena," he said, softer now, though the softness came too late, "you're embarrassing yourself." "No," she said again, "I am finally seeing clearly." She looked around the hall, at the faces she had known for years, faces that had smiled at her during pack dinners, faces that had congratulated her when she and Cade first bonded, faces that now watched her with a mixture of pity and fascination, as though she were a story unfolding, rather than a person standing in pain. None of them stepped forward, none of them said a word in her defense. The silence told her something she should have understood a long time ago. She had never truly belonged here, not as herself, only as an extension of Cade's choice, tolerated because he wanted her, protected only as far as his patience allowed. Ivy lifted her head from Cade's shoulder, wiping at eyes that held no real tears beneath the surface. "Elena, please, don't make this worse," she said, her voice trembling with false gentleness. "I never meant for any of this." Elena almost laughed. The sound nearly escaped her throat before she caught it, swallowed it down, because laughing now would only give them another story to tell about her, another moment of her losing composure while they remained the picture of grace and sorrow. She would not give them that. She turned instead, looking one last time at Cade, searching his face for something, anything, that resembled the man she believed she had loved. She found only irritation, only the desire for this scene to end, so the ceremony could resume, so the visiting alphas could stop watching his pack's dysfunction unfold in real time. "You struck your mate in front of your entire pack because your sister-in-law cried," Elena said, loud enough for the elders near the platform to hear clearly. "I hope, someday, you understand what that means. I hope you understand what you lost tonight. But I will not stay to watch you understand it. I am done." She reached up and touched the mark at the base of her neck, the bond mark that had connected her to Cade since the night they first accepted each other as mates. Her hand trembled only slightly as she spoke the old words, words she had heard once during a ceremony years ago, and never expected to speak herself. The words of release, the words that severed a bond by choice rather than by death. The pack elders gasped as the ancient phrases left her lips, low and deliberate, each syllable carrying weight that settled into the stones of the hall itself. Cade's eyes widened, understanding dawning too slowly, his hand rising as though to stop her, but the words were already spoken, already binding themselves into the fabric of what was and what would never be again. A pulse of energy moved through the hall, invisible but unmistakable, the kind of sensation only wolves could feel, a snapping deep in the chest, a severing that left the air feeling thinner than before. Cade staggered, one hand flying to grip his own chest, his breath catching as though something vital had been torn loose from inside him. Around him, pack members reached out instinctively, though none dared touch their alpha in this moment of visible weakness. "Elena," he gasped, his voice raw now, stripped of its earlier command. "What have you done?" "What I should have done a long time ago," she said. She did not wait for his response. She turned and walked toward the great doors at the end of the hall, her steps steady despite the trembling she felt beneath her skin, despite the ache spreading through her own chest where the bond had lived only moments before. It hurt, more than she expected, a physical wound layered over the invisible one Cade had already given her. But she did not slow, she did not look back. Behind her, she heard Ivy's voice rise in false concern, calling her name, urging her to stop and think this through, urging her not to make a decision she would regret. Elena almost smiled at the desperation buried beneath her sister's performance. Ivy had never expected this outcome. Ivy had wanted sympathy, attention, perhaps a public apology that would cement her place as the more beloved sister. She had not wanted Elena to walk away entirely, because a sister who walked away could not be controlled, could not be used, could not be measured against for comparison and advantage. Elena pushed through the great doors and stepped out into the cold night air. The stars above Thornwood territory looked exactly the same as they had an hour earlier, indifferent to the fact that her entire life had just shattered beneath them. She stood for a moment on the stone steps, breathing hard, feeling the last threads of the bond dissolve completely, leaving behind a hollow ache that settled somewhere deep in her ribs. She thought of the small house she and Cade had shared, filled with 3 years of quiet mornings and shared meals, filled also with 3 years of swallowed words and unspoken resentments. She thought of her mother, long past, who had once told her that family meant protecting each other, and wondered what her mother would think of the sister, who had built her comfort on Elena's constant sacrifice. She thought of the pack she had tried so hard to belong to, and understood now that belonging had never truly been offered to her, only borrowed, only conditional on her silence. She would not go back inside. She would not beg for forgiveness for a mistake she had never made. She turned from the great hall and walked toward the small cottage at the edge of Packland, the one she had shared with Cade since their bonding, and began, with steady hands despite everything inside her that screamed for her to fall apart, to pack a single bag. She took only what belonged truly to her, a few changes of clothes, a worn photograph of her mother, a small pouch of coins she had saved quietly over the years, never quite trusting that her comfort within Thornwood territory was permanent. She left behind the jewelry Cade had given her, the dresses purchased for pack events, anything that reminded her of a life built on someone else's terms. When the bag was full, she stood in the doorway of the cottage and looked back once at the home that had never truly felt like hers. Then she stepped out into the night and began to walk. She did not know exactly where the borders of Thornwood territory ended, only that she needed to cross them, needed distance between herself and everything that had just happened. The forest swallowed her almost immediately, tall trees rising on either side of the narrow path, moonlight filtering down in silver patches that lit her way forward. She walked for hours, her body running on adrenaline and something colder, something that felt almost like clarity. Somewhere behind her she knew, Cade would be recovering from the shock of the severed bond, gathering himself enough to decide whether to send anyone after her. She doubted he would. Pride, more than anything else, would keep him from chasing a mate who had rejected him in front of his own pack. And even if he changed his mind, even if some flicker of guilt pushed him to search for her, she would be long gone by the time he made that decision. The path grew rougher as the night deepened, the trees thickening into wilder growth that suggested she had left cultivated pack territory behind and entered something closer to true wilderness. She should have felt afraid, walking alone through unfamiliar land in the dark, but the fear that lived in her chest belonged entirely to what she had left behind, not to what lay ahead. Whatever waited beyond these trees could not possibly hurt her more than 3 years of quiet dismissal already had. She thought as she walked about the borders that separated Thornwood territory from its neighbors. She had heard whispers over the years of the Bloodmoon Kingdom to the east, ruled by a king whose name was spoken with equal parts respect and caution among Thornwood's elders. She had heard he was fierce in battle and fiercer in loyalty to his own people, that his kingdom had grown strong under his rule despite a difficult and violent history. She had never imagined she would find herself walking toward his borders, alone, wounded, and free for the first time in years. The ache in her chest where the bond had lived grew heavier as exhaustion crept into her limbs. She had not eaten since before the ceremony, had not slept properly in days leading up to it, sensing somehow that trouble was gathering even before it arrived. Her steps began to slow, her vision blurring at the edges, as the adrenaline that had carried her this far finally began to fade. She stumbled once, catching herself against a tree trunk, and realized with distant clarity that she was more depleted than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. Severing a bond took strength, more strength than she had realized when she spoke those ancient words in the hall. Walking for hours afterward on an empty stomach and an exhausted body had drained whatever reserves remained. The trees around her seemed to tilt slightly, the moonlight swimming strangely across the forest floor. She pressed onward anyway, driven by something stubborn and unwilling to stop, some deep instinct that told her stopping here, in unfamiliar wilderness, would not be safe. She did not know how much farther the border lay, did not know what waited for her if she managed to cross it, only knew that she could not go back. Her legs finally gave out somewhere near a small stream she could hear, but could no longer clearly see. She sank to the ground at the base of a wide, ancient tree, her bag slipping from her shoulder, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The last thing she registered before darkness closed over her vision was the distant sound of voices, low and unfamiliar, moving through the trees toward her position, and the sharp, sudden awareness that she had no strength left to run from whatever, or whoever, approached. The forest closed in around her, and Elena Voss, former Luna of Thornwood, let the darkness take her, uncertain whether she would wake to safety or to something far worse. Cold water touched her lips before her eyes opened. Elena stirred, aware first of the taste of something bitter and herbal, then of the warmth of a fire nearby, then of the low murmur of voices speaking in tones too careful to belong to anyone who meant her harm. She blinked against the firelight, her vision slowly sharpening on the face of a woman kneeling beside her, dark hair pulled back, sharp eyes studying her with a mixture of concern and caution. "She's waking," the woman said. Not to Elena, but to someone standing further back in the shadows of what Elena now realized was a large tent, its canvas walls rippling gently in the night air. Elena tried to sit up too quickly, and immediately regretted it, a wave of dizziness pressing her back down against the bedding beneath her. The woman placed a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Slowly," she said. "You collapsed near the border stream. You've been out for almost a full day." A full day. Elena's mind raced through the implications of that single fact. A full day meant she was no longer anywhere near Thornwood territory. A full day meant whoever had found her had carried her, tended to her, kept her safe through an entire night and day without demanding anything in return. At least not yet. "Where am I?" Elena asked, her voice rough from disuse. "Blood Moon territory," the woman answered. "You crossed the border further than you probably realized before you fell. Lucky for you, our patrol found you before anything else did." Elena's stomach tightened at the name. Blood Moon, the kingdom whispered about in Thornwood's halls with a mixture of wariness and respect, the old rival territory that had fought Cade's pack generations ago, before an uneasy peace settled between them, a peace maintained more through mutual distance than genuine friendship. She had walked, without meaning to, directly into the heart of what Thornwood considered its oldest enemy. Before she could formulate another question, the tent flap parted, and a man stepped inside, tall enough that he had to duck slightly beneath the canvas opening. Elena felt her breath catch, not from fear exactly, but from the sheer presence that filled the space the moment he entered. He moved with the quiet control of someone accustomed to command, his dark eyes sweeping over her with an assessment that felt neither hostile nor overly warm, simply thorough, as though he were cataloging every detail that might matter. "You're awake," he said. His voice was low, measured, carrying an authority that needed no volume to assert itself. "Good." Grace was starting to worry you might not wake at all. The woman, Grace apparently, huffed softly from where she knelt beside Elena's bedding. "I said no such thing, Your Majesty." "Your Majesty." The two words landed heavily in Elena's mind. She looked more closely at the man now, taking in the fine but practical clothing, the quiet confidence that surrounded him like a second skin, the way even Grace, clearly comfortable enough to tease him, still deferred to something unspoken in his presence. This was no ordinary patrol leader. This was the king of Blood Moon territory himself. "You're the king," Elena said, before she could stop herself. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Damien Rourke," he said. "And you are on Blood Moon land, unclaimed, wounded, and, if my patrol's report is accurate, carrying the fading mark of a severed bond." His eyes flicked briefly to the base of her neck, where the ghost of Cade's mark still lingered, fading slowly, but not yet gone. "That's an unusual thing to find wandering alone through our borderlands." Elena's hand rose instinctively to cover the mark, though there was little point in hiding what he had already seen. She felt heat rise in her face, embarrassment mixing uncomfortably with the lingering exhaustion in her limbs. "I didn't mean to cross into your territory," she said. "I was walking away from something. I didn't think about where the border was." "Running from Thornwood," Damien said. It was not quite a question. Elena's silence answered for her. Damien's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened slightly, as though her confirmation had settled a suspicion he'd already formed. "You're their former Luna," he said. "Elena Voss, Alpha Thornwood's mate." "Former," Elena corrected quietly. "I severed the bond myself, before I left." That seemed to genuinely surprise him. His brows lifted a fraction, and for a moment, the careful neutrality of his expression cracked just enough to show real curiosity underneath. Severing a bond voluntarily was rare, painful, and irreversible. Most wolves who found themselves in unhappy bonds endured them rather than pay the physical and emotional cost of breaking free. "That takes considerable will," he said finally. "Most wouldn't choose that path, even from a bond gone wrong." "I didn't have much choice left," Elena said. "Not one I could live with, anyway." Grace, still kneeling nearby, glanced between the two of them with an expression Elena couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and quiet calculation. She rose smoothly to her feet. "I'll fetch her some food. She'll need her strength if she's going to keep answering questions instead of resting." Damien nodded once, and Grace slipped out through the tent flap, leaving the two of them alone in the flickering firelight. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have, filled with unspoken questions on both sides. Elena studied the king carefully, trying to reconcile the stories she had heard about Blood Moon's ruler with the man standing before her now. She had expected, if she had expected anything at all, someone colder, someone more calculating, someone who fit the image of an enemy kingdom's leader that Thornwood elders had painted over the years. Instead, she found someone whose eyes carried a weariness she recognized, the particular exhaustion of someone who had fought hard for what they had and trusted very little of it to remain, simply because it had been earned once. "Your advisors won't be pleased that you brought a former Thornwood Luna into your camp," Elena said carefully. "My advisors are rarely pleased with anything I do," Damien replied, and there was the faintest trace of dry humor beneath the words. "I've learned not to let that guide my decisions." "Why did you help me then? I'm nothing to you." "Worse than nothing, according to whatever history exists between our territories." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting briefly toward the tent's entrance, as though considering how much to reveal. When he spoke again, his voice had softened slightly, losing some of its earlier formality. "My patrol found a woman collapsed and alone near our border, wounded not by claws or teeth but by something deeper. I don't leave people to die simply because of which pack raised them," he said. "Whatever history exists between Blood Moon and Thornwood belongs to generations before either of us. I won't pretend it doesn't matter, but it doesn't decide everything either." Elena absorbed his words slowly, feeling something in her chest ease slightly, some small tension she hadn't realized she was carrying since waking in unfamiliar territory. She thought of Cade's easy dismissal of her voice, his willingness to believe the worst of her over a lifetime of loyalty, and found herself comparing it, almost against her will, to this stranger's simple decision to help someone with no claim on his mercy at all. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for finding me, for not leaving me there." Damien inclined his head slightly, accepting the gratitude without making a show of it. "You're welcome to remain here until you've regained your strength," he said. "After that, where you go is your own choice. I won't force you to stay, and I won't force you to leave before you're ready." It was such a small thing, such a simple offer, and yet Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, tears she had refused to shed in front of Cade and Ivy, and the entire watching pack the night before. She blinked them back quickly, unwilling to appear weak in front of this stranger who had already seen enough of her vulnerability for one encounter. Grace returned a few minutes later, carrying a simple wooden tray with bread, a bowl of warm stew, and a cup of water. She set it down beside Elena's bedding with a brisk efficiency that suggested years of practice caring for injured pack members. "Eat slowly," Grace instructed. "Your body's been through more than exhaustion. That bond severing takes a physical toll most people underestimate." Elena nodded, lifting the bowl carefully and taking a small, careful sip of the stew. The warmth spread through her almost immediately, and she realized how genuinely hungry she had been, how long it had truly been since she'd eaten anything substantial. Damien watched her for a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he turned toward the tent entrance. "Rest," he said. "We'll talk more once you've recovered properly. There's no urgency tonight." He left the tent as quietly as he had entered it, and Elena found herself staring after him, turning his words over in her mind. "There's no urgency tonight." Such a simple phrase, and yet it carried a weight of consideration she hadn't experienced in longer than she wanted to admit. Cade had always needed things resolved on his timeline, according to his convenience. This stranger, this supposed enemy king, had just handed her the one thing she desperately needed and hadn't known how to ask for: time, without pressure, without demands. Grace settled onto a low stool near the fire, watching Elena eat with quiet attentiveness. "He doesn't usually bring strangers into his personal camp," she said after a while, her tone conversational, but carrying an edge of genuine observation. "Especially not strangers from Thornwood territory. You should know that." "Why did he then?" Elena asked between careful bites of bread. Grace considered the question for a moment, her sharp eyes studying Elena, as though weighing how much to share. "Damien's seen enough people used and discarded by those who were supposed to protect them," she said finally. "His own path to the throne wasn't easy. He recognizes it when he sees it in someone else, I think. Whatever he saw in you out there in the forest, it mattered enough to bring you here himself, instead of leaving it to the patrol." Elena absorbed this quietly, filing it away alongside everything else she had learned in the last hour. She finished the stew slowly, feeling strength gradually return to her limbs, feeling the sharp edges of exhaustion soften into something more manageable. When Grace finally rose to leave her to rest, Elena settled back against the bedding, staring up at the canvas ceiling of the tent, listening to the distant sounds of the Blood Moon camp settling into nighttime quiet around her. She thought of Thornwood, of the great hall where everything had shattered only a day before, of Cade's face twisted in fury over a lie he never questioned, of Ivy's practiced tears and the flicker of triumph hidden beneath them. She thought of the pack members who had watched her humiliation without a single word raised in her defense. And then she thought of Damien's quiet offer of unconditional time, of Grace's careful tending, of the warmth of a fire built by people who owed her nothing and gave her shelter anyway. For the first time since the slap had cracked across her cheek, Elena allowed herself to breathe fully, to feel the tight coil of tension in her chest loosen just slightly. She did not know what waited for her beyond tonight, did not know how long Blood Moon's hospitality would last, or what it might eventually cost her. But for tonight, surrounded by unfamiliar canvas walls in enemy territory that felt, strangely, safer than the home she had fled, she allowed herself to close her eyes and sleep without fear. Outside the tent, unseen by her, Damien Rourke stood beneath the night sky, his advisors gathered a short distance away, their voices low and urgent, as they debated the wisdom of sheltering a former Thornwood Luna within Blood Moon's borders. He listened to their concerns without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the tent where Elena Voss now slept peacefully for the first time in longer than either of them yet knew. Whatever consequences might follow from his decision, he found himself unwilling to regret it, and that certainty alone told him this situation would prove far more significant than a simple act of Border Patrol mercy. The night deepened around Blood Moon's camp, carrying with it the quiet beginning of something neither Elena nor Damien could yet fully name, but which both of them, in their own separate ways, already sensed had changed the course of everything that would follow. 3 days passed before Elena felt strong enough to leave the tent on her own, and by the fourth morning, she found herself standing at the edge of the Blood Moon camp, watching the sun rise over unfamiliar hills, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel so soon after everything that had happened. Curiosity, not fear, not grief, but a quiet, tentative curiosity about the world she had stumbled into. The Blood Moon camp bore little resemblance to what she had imagined growing up on stories of the rival kingdom. She had expected harsh discipline, cold efficiency, perhaps even cruelty simmering beneath the surface, the kind of atmosphere Thornwood elders always implied when they spoke of their old enemies. Instead, she found something almost startlingly ordinary. Children ran between tents, chasing each other with sticks, fashioned into pretend swords. Women gathered near a central fire pit, laughing over some shared joke as they prepared the morning meal. Warriors trained in a cleared field nearby, their movements sharp and disciplined, but without the underlying tension she remembered from Thornwood's own training grounds, where every sparring match seemed to carry an edge of proving oneself worthy of continued favor. "You're staring," a voice said beside her, and Elena turned to find Grace approaching with 2 cups of something warm and fragrant. "I didn't expect this," Elena admitted, accepting one of the cups gratefully. "I grew up hearing that Blood Moon was harsh, cold, that your king ruled through fear." Grace laughed, a genuine sound that carried real amusement. People say the same things about Thornwood, from what I understand. Funny how enemy kingdoms always sound worse from a distance than they look up close. Elena sipped the warm drink, some kind of herbal tea she didn't recognize but found soothing all the same, and considered Grace's words. She thought of the stories she'd grown up hearing, stories that painted Blood Moon as savage, its people as little better than the beasts they could shift into. She thought of how easily she had believed those stories, without ever questioning where they came from, without ever wondering whether Thornwood's own leadership benefited from keeping such fears alive among its people. "How long have you served the king?" Elena asked, curious despite herself. "Since before he was king," Grace said, a note of pride entering her voice. "I watched him fight for this throne when half his own council doubted he could hold it. His father left this kingdom weaker than it should have been, more interested in appearing strong than actually protecting his people. Damien rebuilt everything from almost nothing, and he did it without becoming the kind of ruler who forgets what it felt like to have nothing." Elena turned this information over in her mind, comparing it to what little she knew of Cade's own rise to alpha, a smooth inheritance from a father who had groomed him for leadership since childhood, never truly tested against real adversity until circumstances forced his hand. She wondered, not for the first time, how much of Cade's blindness toward Ivy's manipulations stemmed from a lifetime of never having to question the people closest to him, never having to develop the sharper instincts that came from surviving genuine hardship. "He mentioned his own path to the throne wasn't easy," Elena said. "That night, when I first woke." Grace's expression grew more serious. "That's not really my story to tell in full," she said, "but I'll say this much. Damien understands what it means to be underestimated by people who should have protected him. He understands what it costs to be betrayed by those closest to you. That's part of why he brought you here himself, I think, rather than leaving you to recover among strangers who wouldn't understand what you were carrying." They walked together through the camp as the morning stretched on, Grace pointing out various landmarks, introducing Elena to a handful of pack members, who greeted her with polite curiosity, rather than the open suspicion Elena had braced herself for. She found herself relaxing gradually, the tight knot of anxiety that had lived in her chest since the night of the ceremony, beginning to loosen further with each passing hour. They found Damien near the training field, watching a group of younger warriors practice with quiet, focused attention. He wore simpler clothing than she had seen him in before, sleeves rolled back, and Elena noticed for the first time the faint scars that marked his forearms, evidence of battles fought long before she had ever crossed his path. He noticed their approach and turned toward them, something in his expression easing slightly at the sight of Elena moving comfortably through his camp, rather than remaining confined to the tent where he'd left her. "You're up and walking," he observed. "Grace tells me you slept through the night without incident." "I feel stronger," Elena said, and found she meant it. "Thank you again, for everything you've done." Damien studied her for a moment, his dark eyes carrying that same careful assessment she had noticed the first night, though now, it felt less like scrutiny and more like genuine attention. "You'll need proper clothing suited to our climate if you intend to stay a while longer," he said, "and you should meet with our healer properly, to be certain the bond severing hasn't left any lasting damage." "I don't want to be a burden," Elena said quickly. "You've already done more than I could have asked." "You're not a burden," Damien said, his voice firm enough to end further argument. "You're a guest, for as long as you choose to remain one." Grace, standing slightly to the side, exchanged a look with one of the nearby warriors that Elena didn't quite catch the meaning of, though something in the exchange suggested this level of personal attention from their king was unusual enough to draw notice among his own people. Elena felt a flush of self-consciousness color her cheeks, aware suddenly of how much attention she was receiving, aware of how strange this entire situation might look from the outside. Over the following days, a quiet rhythm began to settle around Elena's presence in the Blood Moon camp. She spent mornings with Grace, learning the layout of the territory, the names of pack members, the small customs that differed subtly from what she had known in Thornwood. Afternoons often found her near the training field, watching Damien oversee his warriors, occasionally exchanging brief conversations with him when his duties allowed a pause. Evenings brought shared meals around the central fire, where she found herself gradually drawn into conversations, laughing at jokes she wouldn't have expected to find funny only days before. Feeling something inside her that had been dormant for years slowly begin to wake. She noticed things about Damien that surprised her the longer she observed him. He listened when his advisors spoke, even when he ultimately disagreed with their counsel. He remembered small details about the people under his care, asking after a warrior's injured leg, checking in on a mother whose child had fallen ill the week before. He never raised his voice, not once, even when frustration clearly simmered beneath his composed exterior during difficult council discussions she occasionally overheard. It stood in such stark contrast to everything she had known with Cade that Elena found herself almost disoriented by the comparison. Cade had never once asked after the well-being of pack members below a certain rank, had rarely remembered names beyond those who directly served his interests, had raised his voice often enough that pack members learned to read his moods before approaching him with any request. She had accepted this as simply the nature of leadership, had told herself that all alphas carried this same distance, this same difficulty connecting with those beneath them. Watching Damien move through his own kingdom taught her, slowly and unmistakably, that this had never been true. Cade had simply chosen distance, chosen dismissal, chosen to let his own comfort outweigh genuine connection with the people who depended on him. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Elena found herself sitting alone near the edge of the camp, watching the sun set over the distant hills, when Damien joined her, settling onto the ground a respectful distance away, without asking permission or waiting for invitation, simply present in the comfortable way that had become familiar between them. "You've been quiet today," he observed. "I've been thinking," Elena admitted, "about everything that happened, about how long I let it happen before I finally left." Damien remained silent, giving her space to continue if she wished, without pressing for details she hadn't offered. It was such a small thing, this patience, and yet it meant more to her than she knew how to express. "My sister has always been like this," Elena said finally, the words coming slowly at first, then faster, as the dam holding them back began to crack. "Since we were children, she learned early that tears got her whatever she wanted, that crying in front of our parents meant I would be blamed for whatever had actually happened. I thought it would stop when we grew up. I thought Cade would see through it eventually. Instead, he simply became another person she learned to manipulate, and I became the convenient explanation for whatever went wrong in her life. That's not a small thing to carry for years," Damien said quietly. "I told myself it was manageable. I told myself love meant enduring difficult things for the sake of what mattered more. I didn't realize how much of myself I was losing until I was standing there with my cheek burning, watching him choose her lies over 3 years of my loyalty, and something in me simply refused to bend any further." Damien turned to look at her fully now, his expression carrying none of the pity she had braced herself to see, only quiet understanding. "You didn't lose yourself," he said. "You found the point where you refused to disappear entirely. That's not the same thing as breaking. That's the moment you started to heal, even if it didn't feel that way at the time." Elena felt tears threaten again, closer to the surface than she wanted to admit, and this time she didn't fight them back entirely, letting a few slip free as she stared out at the darkening horizon. Damien didn't reach for her, didn't offer the kind of physical comfort that might have felt presumptuous, given how recently she had escaped one bond, and how little time had passed since her world had shattered. He simply remained beside her, a steady, quiet presence, until the tears passed and her breathing steadied again. "Thank you," she said eventually, "for not asking me to explain myself further than I'm ready to, for not pushing." "You've had enough people pushing you into corners," Damien said simply. "I'd rather earn whatever trust you're willing to give me than demand it before you're ready." They sat together in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, and Elena found herself, for the first time since walking away from Thornwood's great hall, feeling something that resembled hope rather than mere survival. She did not yet know what this growing connection with Damien meant, did not know whether Blood Moon territory would remain her home or simply a way station on the path to somewhere else entirely. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was no longer the same woman who had collapsed near that border stream 2 weeks earlier, and whatever came next, she intended to face it as herself, fully, without apology. Far to the west, In Thornwood territory, news of Elena's survival had already begun to spread through whispered channels, carried by traders and travelers who moved between the two kingdoms, despite the old tensions between them. Cade Thornwood sat alone in his private quarters that same evening, staring at nothing, the hollow ache where his bond with Elena had once lived, still throbbing faintly beneath his ribs, and felt, for the first time since the night of the ceremony, a flicker of doubt creep into the certainty that had driven him to strike his mate in front of his entire pack. The doubt that had crept into Cade's mind that evening grew heavier with each passing day, though he refused, at first, to name it honestly even to himself. He told himself Elena's departure was simply a temporary rebellion, a dramatic gesture that would fade once she realized the difficulty of surviving outside pack protection. He told himself she would return within weeks, humbled and ready to accept whatever terms he chose to offer. But weeks passed, and no word came, and the hollow space beneath his ribs, where their bond had once lived, refused to heal or fade the way he had expected it might. Ivy, for her part, seemed entirely unbothered by her sister's absence. If anything, she appeared to bloom in the aftermath, stepping easily into the role Elena had once occupied, accompanying Cade to pack functions, offering opinions on matters of governance that she had no real qualification to weigh in on. Pack members who had once treated her with the careful courtesy reserved for the Luna's sister now began, slowly, to defer to her as though she had always been meant for greater status. Cade, distracted by his own unresolved guilt and the physical discomfort of the severed bond, failed to notice how quickly and thoroughly his sister-in-law was reshaping her position within pack hierarchy. It was Grandmother Wren, the eldest of Thornwood's pack elders, who first began to voice quiet concerns. She had served 3 generations of Thornwood alphas, had watched countless pack dramas unfold and resolve over her long lifetime, and something about the ease with which Ivy filled the vacancy left by her sister's departure struck her as unnatural, too smooth, too convenient. "Have you considered," Wren said to Cade one afternoon, finding him alone in his study, staring at documents he clearly wasn't reading, "that the story you were told that night might not have been entirely truthful?" Cade's head snapped up, irritation flashing across his features. "Are you suggesting Ivy lied to me?" "I'm suggesting you never asked Elena for her side of events before you struck her in front of the entire pack," Wren said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "I have known that girl since she first arrived in this territory, as your intended mate. In 3 years, I never once saw her behave with the cruelty Ivy accused her of that night. Not once." Cade's jaw tightened, old defensiveness rising automatically to counter the elder's words, but something in Wren's steady gaze prevented him from dismissing her outright, the way he might have dismissed a younger, less respected voice. He thought back, despite himself, to the moment before the slap, trying to recall Elena's expression, her words, anything that might have suggested genuine guilt rather than simple shock at an accusation she hadn't seen coming. He remembered her face clearly now that he allowed himself to look back honestly. Confusion, not guilt. Confusion, followed swiftly by a kind of weary resignation that he had mistaken, in the heat of the moment, for defiance rather than exhaustion. "I don't have proof either way," Wren continued, watching him process these thoughts. "But I would encourage you, Alpha, to consider your sister-in-law's behavior since that night with clearer eyes. Grief does not typically make a person bloom the way Ivy has bloomed these past weeks." She left him alone with those words, and Cade sat for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, the doubt that had first crept in weeks earlier, finally taking firmer root in his mind. He began, slowly and quietly, to watch Ivy more closely, to notice the small inconsistencies in her stories, the way she subtly steered conversations toward her own advantage, the way pack members who had once been close to Elena now seemed to avoid Ivy's company when they thought no one important was watching. Meanwhile, in Blood Moon territory, Elena's recovery continued steadily, both physically and in the deeper wounds that had taken far longer than a bond severing to inflict. She had settled into a routine that felt, increasingly, like something resembling a real life rather than a temporary refuge. She had begun assisting Grace with organizing the camp's supply stores, discovering an unexpected talent for the kind of careful, detail-oriented work that Thornwood had never valued highly enough to let her pursue. She had made friends among the younger warriors, sharing meals and easy conversation that carried none of the careful political calculation she had grown accustomed to at Thornwood gatherings. And she had grown closer to Damien, in ways that surprised her with their gentleness. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, never assumed familiarity she hadn't offered, and yet the space between them had narrowed steadily over the weeks, filled with quiet conversations that stretched long into the evenings, with the kind of comfortable silence that only grew between people who had begun, without quite naming it, to trust each other deeply. "You've changed since you first arrived here," Grace observed one afternoon, as she and Elena worked together sorting winter supplies in preparation for the coming cold season. "You stand differently now, like you're not bracing for something to go wrong." Elena considered this, surprised to realize how true it felt. "I think I spent so many years bracing for disappointment that I forgot what it felt like not to," she admitted. "It's strange, being somewhere I don't have to constantly calculate how my actions will be perceived, or worry that something I say might be twisted into a weapon against me." "That's what safety feels like," Grace said simply. "Most people forget, if they've never had to live without it." Elena thought about this often in the weeks that followed, turning the idea over in her mind, as she watched Damien move through his kingdom with quiet confidence, as she felt herself gradually shedding the careful, defensive posture she had carried through 3 years of Thornwood life. She had not realized, until its absence, how much energy that constant vigilance had consumed, how much of herself she had spent simply surviving rather than actually living. One evening, as autumn began to settle fully over Blood Moon territory, Damien found her sitting near the edge of camp, watching the last light fade from the sky, much as she had done weeks earlier when she first began to share pieces of her history with him. He settled beside her, close enough now that their shoulders nearly touched, a closeness that would have felt presumptuous weeks earlier, but now felt entirely natural. "I received word today," he said, "that Thornwood has learned of your presence here." Elena's stomach tightened, old anxiety flaring briefly before she forced herself to breathe through it. "How? We've been careful." "Traders talk, regardless of how careful anyone tries to be," Damien said. "It's the nature of territories that border each other closely enough to share commerce. I wanted you to hear it from me before rumors reached you through less reliable channels." Elena absorbed this news slowly, feeling the peace she had built over the past weeks wobble slightly under the weight of Thornwood's re-entry into her thoughts. "What does this mean? Will Cade come looking for me?" "I don't know," Damien admitted honestly. "Pride might keep him from pursuing a mate who publicly rejected him, or the rumors might wound that same pride enough to provoke a response. Either way, I want you to know that whatever happens, you are not obligated to face it alone, and you are not obligated to return to Thornwood if that isn't what you choose." Elena turned to look at him fully, studying the steady certainty in his expression, the quiet promise underlying his words. "Why do you care so much what happens to me?" she asked, the question she had wondered for weeks, finally finding its way past her lips. "I arrived here as a stranger, collapsed and half dead near your border. You owed me nothing." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers, something vulnerable flickering briefly beneath his usual composure. "Because somewhere along these past weeks," he said finally, "you stopped being simply a stranger I found in the forest, and became someone whose well-being matters to me for reasons that have very little to do with obligation." The words settled between them, quiet and significant, and Elena felt her heart quicken in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in longer than she wanted to admit. She thought of the careful walls she had built around herself since arriving, walls meant to protect her from repeating the same mistakes that had cost her so dearly with Cade, and felt those walls trembling now under the weight of Damien's honesty. "I'm not ready to name what this is between us," she said carefully, wanting to be honest rather than simply saying what might please him. "I severed a bond only weeks ago. I'm still learning who I am outside of what Cade and Ivy needed me to be." "I'm not asking you to name anything," Damien said gently. "I'm asking you to know that whatever pace you need, whatever time this requires, I'm not going anywhere. You're safe here, Elena, for as long as you need that safety, regardless of what grows or doesn't grow between us." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes again, though these carried none of the grief that had accompanied her earlier tears in his presence. These felt closer to relief, to gratitude, to the slow, tentative unfurling of something that had been closed tightly shut for far too long. She reached out, hesitantly, and let her hand rest against his, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers, feeling something settle into place that she hadn't realized had been missing. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me room to become myself again, before asking me to become anything else." They sat together as full darkness settled over the camp, the distant sounds of Blood Moon's evening routines continuing around them, and Elena felt, for the first time since the night everything shattered in Thornwood's great hall, that she was not simply surviving her new circumstances, but genuinely beginning to heal within them. Winter approached slowly over Blood Moon territory, painting the hills in shades of gold and rust before the first frost arrived, and with its approach came a steady stream of small revelations that reshaped Elena's understanding of everything she had left behind. Grace had taken to sharing stories of Damien's early struggles as she and Elena worked together through the shortening autumn days, stories that painted a picture of a young king who had inherited a kingdom hollowed out by his own father's negligence and had rebuilt it through sheer determination rather than any inherited advantage. His father cared more about appearing strong to neighboring territories than actually strengthening Blood Moon itself, Grace explained one afternoon, as they mended winter cloaks near the central fire. By the time Damien took the throne, half our warriors had drifted to other territories seeking better leadership, our stores were nearly empty heading into a brutal winter, and our borders were vulnerable enough that 3 separate territories tested them within his first year of rule. How did he manage to turn things around? Elena asked, genuinely curious. Patience, consistency. He listened to people his father had dismissed as unimportant, rebuilt trust one small promise kept at a time. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't quick, but 5 years later, Blood Moon stands stronger than it has in generations, and our people trust their king in a way they never trusted his father. Elena absorbed this information slowly, feeling it settle alongside everything else she had learned about Damien over the preceding weeks, and found herself understanding, more deeply than before, why his quiet patience with her own healing felt so genuine, rather than performed. He had learned, through hard experience, that real strength came from consistency rather than dramatic gestures, from small promises kept over time rather than grand declarations that faded once convenient. She thought, inevitably, of Cade, of the ease with which he had inherited his position, of the way his authority had never truly been tested until circumstances forced genuine adversity into his path. She wondered whether a Cade who had faced real hardship, who had been forced to earn rather than inherit his people's trust, might have developed the same careful attentiveness she saw in Damien, might have learned to question easy assumptions rather than believing the loudest voice in any given conflict. It was a painful thought in some ways, recognizing that the man she had loved for 3 years might have become someone different under different circumstances, that his failures weren't simply inherent cruelty, but the product of never having been tested in ways that built genuine wisdom. It didn't excuse what he had done. It didn't make the slap hurt any less in memory, or make Ivy's manipulations any less cruel, but it added a layer of complexity to her grief that she hadn't expected, a recognition that people could be shaped by circumstance into versions of themselves that caused genuine harm without necessarily being irredeemably broken at their core. She shared some of these thoughts with Damien one evening, as they walked together along the edge of camp, the cold autumn air sharp against their skin. "I keep thinking about whether things could have been different," she admitted. "Whether Cade might have become someone else entirely if his path to leadership had tested him the way yours tested you." Damien considered this carefully before responding, never one to offer easy reassurance when genuine reflection served better. "It's possible," he said finally. "Circumstance shapes all of us, in ways we don't always recognize until we're forced to confront them. But circumstance also doesn't excuse the choices people make once they understand the harm they're causing. They'd had years to notice the pattern of favoring your sister's word over yours. He chose, repeatedly, not to question it, even when the evidence should have prompted questions. That choice belongs to him, regardless of how his own upbringing shaped his instincts." Elena nodded slowly, feeling the truth of his words settle into place, alongside her more complicated feelings. "I don't hate him," she said quietly, testing the words as she spoke them. I thought I would, after everything. But mostly, I just feel sad. Sad for the years I spent making myself smaller to accommodate a blindness he never tried hard enough to correct. That sadness is allowed to exist alongside everything else you're feeling, Damien said. Healing isn't always a straight path from anger to peace. Sometimes it moves through grief, through complicated understanding, before it settles into something more resolved. They continued walking in comfortable silence for a while, the last light of the autumn afternoon fading gradually around them, before Elena spoke again, her voice carrying a different kind of weight now. I want to tell you about Ivy properly, she said. Not just the surface version, but everything. I think you deserve to understand fully what you've welcomed into your territory. Damien turned to look at her, giving her his full attention, and Elena found herself grateful, not for the first time, for his ability to simply listen, without rushing to fill silence with reassurance or advice she hadn't asked for. Ivy was always different from me, Elena began, the words coming slowly at first, then more steadily as she found her rhythm. Our parents doted on her from the time she was very young, in ways they never quite managed with me. I used to think it was simply because she was younger, that youngest children often receive more indulgence. But looking back now, I think she learned early that tears and vulnerability earned her attention and protection in ways that competence and independence never did for me. I was praised for being capable, for handling things on my own. She was comforted for struggling, even when her struggles were exaggerated or entirely fabricated. She told him about specific incidents from their childhood, careful to keep her account measured rather than bitter, though the weight of years of accumulated small injustices carried its own heaviness, regardless of how carefully she framed each memory. She told him about the time Ivy had broken a treasured family heirloom and blamed Elena convincingly enough that Elena had been punished for weeks over a crime she hadn't committed. She told him about the pattern that had continued into adulthood, growing more sophisticated as Ivy learned to manipulate larger and larger circumstances to her advantage. When Cade chose me as his mate, I think something in Ivy shifted, Elena continued. She'd always competed with me in small ways growing up, but suddenly the stakes felt higher. I was going to be Luna. I was going to have status she couldn't easily match. I think she decided, somewhere along the way, that if she couldn't have that status herself, she would find ways to diminish mine instead. And Cade never questioned the pattern, Damien said quietly. Not quite a question. He wanted to believe the best of everyone around him, I think. It made him easy for her to manipulate, because he genuinely didn't want to believe someone close to him could behave with such calculated cruelty. It was easier for him to believe I had changed, had become someone capable of genuine unkindness, than to believe Ivy had been manipulating him for years. Damien was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had shared, before he spoke again, his voice carrying a new edge of protective anger that Elena hadn't heard from him before. She sounds dangerous, he said. Not simply difficult, but genuinely dangerous, in the way she's willing to sacrifice others for her own advantage. I think she is, Elena admitted. I spent years telling myself it was simply sibling rivalry, something we would eventually grow out of. I don't think that's true anymore. I think she'll continue this pattern with whoever gives her the opportunity, unless something eventually forces genuine consequences into her path. Then we should be prepared, Damien said, for whatever consequences might follow from Thornwood learning your location. If Ivy has as much influence over Cade as you're describing, she may see your continued absence as a threat to whatever position she's built for herself in your place. Elena felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cooling autumn air, recognizing the truth in his words, even as she wished she could dismiss the concern entirely. Ivy had never simply let things go, not when abandoning a narrative meant losing whatever advantage that narrative provided. If word reached her that Elena had found safety, had found genuine standing within a rival kingdom, Elena doubted her sister would simply accept that outcome without attempting some further manipulation to reclaim control over the situation. What do we do? Elena asked, genuinely uncertain for the first time in weeks about the path forward. We prepare, Damien said simply. We strengthen our position, gather whatever information might prove useful if Thornwood does attempt some form of confrontation, and we make certain you never again face difficult truths alone. without allies willing to stand beside you. The certainty in his voice settled something anxious in Elena's chest, and she found herself, not for the first time, deeply grateful for the strange twist of fate that had led her collapsed and wounded to Blood Moon's border, rather than anywhere else entirely. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she no longer faced them as the isolated, dismissed Luna she had been within Thornwood's halls. She faced them now as someone genuinely valued, genuinely protected, and increasingly, genuinely loved by people who had chosen her not out of obligation, but out of authentic care that asked nothing in return beyond her own honest presence. The trader who carried word of Elena's survival back to Thornwood territory had no idea of the storm his casual mention would unleash. He had simply remarked, over a shared meal with a Thornwood merchant, that Blood Moon's king had taken in a wounded traveler weeks earlier, a woman later recognized as the former Luna, who had walked away from her mate in front of his entire pack. The merchant, eager for gossip that might earn him favor among the pack elders, carried the story back to Thornwood territory within days, and from there it spread through the pack like fire through dry grass. Ivy heard the news while sitting in what had become, over the preceding weeks, essentially her private receiving room, a space Cade had quietly allowed her to claim as she settled deeper into the role Elena had once occupied. Her expression, upon hearing the news from a nervous pack member, who clearly hadn't wanted to be the one delivering it, shifted through several rapid emotions before settling into something carefully controlled. "She's alive," Ivy said slowly, testing the words, "and sheltered by Blood Moon." "That's what the traders are saying, yes," the pack member confirmed, watching Ivy's face carefully for some cue as to how she should react to this development herself. Ivy dismissed the pack member with a wave of her hand, needing solitude to process this information properly before deciding how to present her reaction to Cade. Part of her had assumed, when Elena disappeared into the forest that night, that her sister's story had effectively ended, that whatever came of her wandering alone into unfamiliar territory would resolve itself without further complication. Elena's survival, and worse, her apparent shelter within Blood Moon's own royal camp, threatened to unravel weeks of careful positioning Ivy had built for herself in her sister's absence. She needed to reach Cade before he heard the news from anyone else, needed to shape his understanding of this development before doubt could take root and grow beyond her ability to manage it. She found him in his study, staring at the same unread documents he had been staring at for weeks, his expression carrying the same distracted heaviness that had settled over him since the night Elena severed their bond. "Cade," she said softly, approaching with practiced gentleness, "I need to tell you something difficult." He looked up, immediately attentive in the way he always was when Ivy's voice carried distress, and Ivy felt a flicker of satisfaction at how easily that old pattern still worked, even weeks into her sister's absence. "What's happened?" "There are rumors spreading through the traders," she said, keeping her voice carefully measured, neither too casual nor too dramatic. "About Elena. They're saying she's alive, sheltered somewhere in Blood Moon territory." Cade's reaction was immediate and visceral, his entire posture shifting, something flickering across his face that Ivy recognized with a sinking unease as relief, genuine relief, rather than the anger or dismissal she had hoped to provoke. "She's alive," he said quietly, more to himself than to Ivy. "She's safe." "Cade," Ivy said, injecting a note of concern into her voice. "She's been sheltered by our oldest rival. What if she's told them things about our pack, about our vulnerabilities? What if this is dangerous for Thornwood?" But Cade barely seemed to register her words, his mind clearly caught on the simple, overwhelming relief of learning that Elena hadn't perished alone in the forest, that whatever guilt he had carried these past weeks, over potentially having driven her to her death, could finally ease. Ivy watched this reaction with growing alarm, recognizing that her carefully constructed narrative was slipping further from her control with each passing moment. "I need to know more," Cade said finally, rising from his desk with a purposefulness Ivy hadn't seen from him in weeks. "I need to send someone to confirm this, to learn the full situation. Cade, please think carefully before acting rashly," Ivy said, her voice sharpening slightly, despite her efforts to maintain careful control. "Blood Moon has never been a friend to Thornwood. Sending someone into their territory could be seen as provocation. Or it could simply be seen as a pack checking on the well-being of someone who once belonged to us, Cade replied, and something in his tone suggested that whatever spell Ivy's tears had once cast over his judgment was beginning, slowly, to weaken. I need to know if she's truly safe, Ivy. I need to understand what actually happened that night, without the distortion of my own anger clouding my judgment. Ivy felt genuine panic flare beneath her carefully maintained composure, recognizing the danger in Cade's newfound desire for clarity. If he began questioning the events of that night too closely, if he sought out witnesses beyond her own carefully curated version of events, the entire foundation she had built over these past weeks risked collapsing entirely. I only meant that I was there, she said quickly, changing tactics. I know what happened. Why would you need to seek confirmation elsewhere when I've already told you everything? Cade turned to look at her fully now, something new and unfamiliar in his gaze, a scrutiny she hadn't experienced from him before. Grandmother Wren has raised questions about that night, he said slowly, about whether your account matched what others observed. I dismissed her concerns at the time, too caught up in my own anger to consider them seriously. I don't intend to make that same mistake again. Ivy's mind raced, searching for some path forward that would salvage her position, but she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, without an immediately obvious manipulation to deploy. Cade's grief over Elena's absence, his relief at learning she remained alive, had cracked open something in him that her tears alone could no longer easily seal shut. I would never lie to you, she said finally, falling back on simple denial when more sophisticated tactics failed to present themselves. Elena pushed me. She said cruel things. I don't understand why you would doubt me now, after everything. I'm not doubting you entirely, Cade said, though his tone suggested otherwise. I'm simply choosing, finally, to seek a fuller understanding before I act on assumptions alone. That's something I should have done weeks ago, before I struck my mate in front of our entire pack based on a single, unverified account. He left the study then, leaving Ivy standing alone with her carefully constructed world beginning to fracture around her, and for the first time since orchestrating the confrontation that had driven her sister away, Ivy felt something close to genuine fear settle into her chest. She had built her current position on the assumption that Elena would either return humbled and easily managed, or would remain permanently gone, unable to challenge Ivy's version of events from wherever she had disappeared to. The possibility that Elena might not only survive, but find genuine shelter and standing within a rival kingdom, might eventually find her voice to speak the truth from a position of newfound strength, threatened to unravel everything Ivy had worked so carefully to build. She needed a new strategy, and she needed it quickly, before Cade's growing doubt hardened into something she could no longer manage or redirect. Over the following days, Cade moved through his duties with a new, quiet intensity, sending careful inquiries through trusted channels to confirm the details of the rumors circulating about Elena's whereabouts. He spoke separately with several pack members who had witnessed the confrontation that final night, listening more carefully than he had allowed himself to during the actual event, and found, piece by piece, an account that diverged significantly from the version Ivy had presented him that evening. Grandmother Wren, sensing the shift in Cade's willingness to question the narrative he had accepted so readily weeks earlier, offered her own careful recollection of events. I watched Elena's face that night, before you struck her, the elder said. I saw confusion, not guilt. I saw someone genuinely bewildered by an accusation she hadn't anticipated. I should have spoken up sooner, Alpha. I regret that I didn't trust my own observation enough to challenge you in that moment. You tried, afterward, Cade said. I wasn't ready to listen. Are you ready now? Cade considered the question seriously, feeling the weight of weeks of hollow guilt and unexplained doubt finally beginning to coalesce into something resembling clarity. I think I need to understand fully what happened, he said, regardless of how difficult that understanding might prove. He began, methodically and with growing unease, to piece together a pattern he had somehow managed to overlook for 3 years. A pattern of small inconsistencies in Ivy's stories, of pack members who had quietly avoided confrontation with her, rather than risk her carefully deployed tears, of Elena's consistent, quiet endurance in the face of accusations that, upon closer examination, rarely held up under scrutiny. Each piece he uncovered added weight to a growing certainty he found increasingly difficult to ignore, however much he might have wished to avoid confronting the full scope of his own failure to see clearly during the years he had shared with Elena. The realization settled over him slowly, painfully, carrying with it a grief that felt entirely new, distinct from the hollow physical ache of the severed bond. He had failed Elena, repeatedly and significantly, choosing comfortable assumptions over difficult truths, choosing his sister-in-law's practiced vulnerability over his mate's steady, unglamorous loyalty. Whatever came next, whatever path lay ahead for Thornwood and its relationship with Blood Moon territory, Cade understood now that he owed Elena an accounting far more significant than anything he had offered her during their final confrontation, and he began, with the same methodical determination he had once reserved for pack governance, to consider how he might begin to make amends for a wrong that words alone could never fully repair. Winter settled fully over Blood Moon territory by the time Damien called Elena to walk with him along the ridge overlooking the entire camp, the snow crunching softly beneath their boots, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. Something in his manner felt different that day, a quiet purposefulness beneath his usual calm, and Elena found herself curious about what had prompted this particular invitation. "I've been thinking about something for weeks now," Damien began, his gaze fixed on the horizon rather than on her, giving her space to react without the pressure of his direct attention. "And I wanted to share it with you honestly, without any expectation of a particular response." Elena felt her heart quicken slightly, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, waiting for him to continue. Over the months since her arrival, their relationship had deepened steadily, moving from cautious friendship into something warmer, something that carried real tenderness on both sides, though neither of them had yet named it fully, or discussed what it might mean for their respective futures. "You've built a genuine life here," Damien continued. "Grace tells me you've become indispensable to the camp's organization. The younger warriors ask after you when you're not present at meals. You've found, I think, a place here that feels like home, rather than simply refuge." "It has become that," Elena agreed quietly, "more than I expected when I first collapsed near your border all those months ago." "I want to offer you something," Damien said, finally turning to look at her directly, his dark eyes carrying a vulnerability she rarely saw from him. "Not out of obligation, and not because I expect any particular answer. I want you to know that whatever you choose, you'll always have a place here, as a friend, as someone this kingdom values, regardless of what else might or might not exist between us." Elena waited, her breath held slightly, sensing that whatever came next carried significant weight for both of them. "I would like you to consider becoming my Luna Queen," Damien said, the words carrying none of the performative grandeur she might have expected from such a declaration, only quiet, genuine sincerity. "Not because tradition demands a king have a queen, and not because I want to simply replace what you lost with something similar in shape, but different in substance. I'm asking because these past months have shown me someone whose strength, whose quiet resilience, whose capacity for genuine care, despite everything you've endured, has become something I genuinely cherish. I would be honored to build a partnership with you, on whatever terms you need it to take, at whatever pace feels right to you." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, though these carried none of the grief that had marked so many of her earlier emotional moments in Blood Moon territory. These felt closer to overwhelming gratitude, mixed with a caution she couldn't entirely shake, despite everything Damien had shown her over the preceding months. "I need to be honest with you," she said carefully. "Part of me is afraid, not of you, but of repeating old patterns without recognizing them until it's too late. I spent 3 years believing Cade's version of partnership meant something genuine, only to discover how conditional his care actually was. I don't want to make that same mistake again, even with someone as different from him as you've shown yourself to be." "That fear is reasonable," Damien said, without any defensiveness in his tone. "I don't expect you to simply trust blindly because I've said the right words. Trust builds through consistent action over time, not through declarations alone. If you choose to accept this offer, I don't expect it to erase that caution instantly. I only hope that my actions, over whatever time you need to feel certain, will continue to demonstrate that this partnership means something different from what you experienced before." Elena considered his words carefully, thinking back over the months of quiet consistency he had shown her, the patience that had never once curdled into impatience or demand, the genuine respect he had extended toward her voice, and her choices, even when doing so complicated his own political position with his advisors. She thought of the difference between Cade's easy assumptions and Damien's careful attentiveness, between a partnership built on one person's convenience and one built on genuine mutual consideration. "I want this," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "Not because I need rescue, and not because I'm afraid of facing the future alone. I want this because you've shown me, consistently, and without demanding anything in return, what genuine partnership actually looks like. I choose this because it's right for me, not because I have no other options." Something eased in Damien's expression at her words, a relief he hadn't quite managed to hide despite his careful composure throughout the conversation. "Then I would be honored," he said, "to build that future with you, at whatever pace and on whatever terms serve you best." They stood together on the ridge for a long moment, the winter landscape stretching out around them in quiet beauty, before Damien reached out and gently took her hand, a simple gesture that carried none of the possessive urgency she had sometimes felt from Cade during their own courtship, only quiet, patient affection that asked nothing beyond her genuine presence. "There will be complications," Damien said eventually, as they began walking back toward the camp. "My advisors will have concerns about the political implications of a former Thornwood Luna becoming Blood Moon's queen. There may be those within our own pack who question the wisdom of this choice, given our territory's history. I understand," Elena said. "I don't expect this to be simple, or without resistance." "We'll face whatever comes together," Damien said. "That's the promise I'm making to you, regardless of how complicated the path ahead might prove." Word of their engagement spread through Blood Moon's camp within days, and Elena braced herself for resistance, for the kind of quiet disapproval she had grown accustomed to navigating within Thornwood's more rigid hierarchy. Instead, she found something closer to genuine celebration. Pack members who had grown fond of her presence over the preceding months offering sincere congratulations. Warriors who had trained alongside her clapping Damien on the shoulder with evident approval. Grace, in particular, seemed genuinely delighted by the news, embracing Elena with a warmth that spoke to real affection built over months of shared work and conversation. "I knew this would happen," Grace said, laughing as she pulled back from the embrace. "The way he looked at you that first night, when he carried you back to camp himself rather than leaving it to the patrol. I told the other warriors then that our king had found something significant. Not everyone welcomed the news with equal enthusiasm, however. Damien's senior advisor, an older warrior named Edward who had served the kingdom since before Damien's own birth, expressed his concerns directly during a council meeting Elena had been invited to attend as part of her gradual integration into Blood Moon's governance structure. "Your Majesty," Edward said carefully, "I understand the personal considerations at play, but I would be remiss not to raise the political complications. Thornwood remains a significant neighboring power. Elevating their former Luna to queen of our own kingdom risks provoking exactly the kind of conflict we've worked years to avoid." "I've considered those risks carefully," Damien replied, his tone respectful but firm. "But I won't let political calculation override genuine partnership. Elena's presence here strengthens this kingdom, not weakens it. Her insight into Thornwood's internal politics, gained through years of first-hand experience, may prove more valuable than any risk her presence introduces." Elena spoke up then, finding her voice within the council chamber with a confidence that surprised even herself. "I understand the concerns," she said, addressing Edward directly. "I know my history with Thornwood complicates the political calculus here. But I can offer something valuable in return for the trust you're being asked to extend. I know Thornwood's weaknesses, its internal tensions, in ways few outside its own pack could claim. If conflict does arise, that knowledge could prove significant in protecting Blood Moon's interests." Edward studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression as he weighed her words. "That's a fair point," he acknowledged eventually. "I withdraw my objection, though I would ask that we proceed carefully, with full awareness of the risks involved." "Agreed," Damien said, And Elena felt a swell of pride at how smoothly she had navigated the exchange, how naturally her voice now carried weight within rooms that would have never granted her such consideration during her years within Thornwood's own hierarchy. As winter deepened around Blood Moon territory, preparations for the eventual coronation began quietly, alongside continued efforts to gather information about the shifting situation within Thornwood itself. Elena found herself, increasingly, stepping into a role that felt genuinely suited to her strengths. Her careful attention to detail, her deep understanding of pack politics gained through years of quiet observation, her growing confidence in speaking truth even when that truth complicated easy assumptions. She was becoming, piece by piece, the version of herself that Thornwood's rigid hierarchy had never allowed her to fully develop, and with each passing week, that emerging strength felt less like something she needed to prove to others, and more like something she simply, finally, embodied. Cade arrived at Blood Moon's border on a cold morning in early spring, accompanied by only a small delegation, a deliberate choice meant to signal that he came seeking understanding rather than confrontation. Word of his approach had reached Blood Moon's camp a full day earlier, giving Elena and Damien time to prepare for whatever this visit might bring, though neither of them could be entirely certain what version of Cade would arrive at their gates. Elena stood beside Damien as the delegation approached, her posture steady despite the nervous energy coiling in her stomach. She had not seen Cade since the night she severed their bond, had not heard his voice or looked into his eyes since the moment she walked away from everything she had once believed constituted her life. Whatever remained between them now, she intended to face it as the woman she had become over these past months, not as the diminished Luna who had once absorbed his dismissal without protest. Cade dismounted slowly at the agreed meeting point, just inside Blood Moon's border, his eyes finding Elena immediately across the gathered crowd, something complicated passing across his features at the sight of her. She looked different, he realized immediately, though he couldn't quite articulate what exactly had changed. She stood taller, perhaps, carried herself with a confidence he didn't remember from their years together, though he suspected, with growing discomfort, that this confidence had always existed within her, simply suppressed by years of accommodating his own blindness. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying genuine emotion he made no effort to hide, "I'm relieved to see you well." "Cade," she replied, her voice steady and measured, neither warm nor hostile, simply careful. "I understand you've come seeking answers about what happened that night." "I've come," Cade said, "because I owe you an accounting I should have offered months ago, before my own pride and misplaced anger drove you from everything you'd built within Thornwood territory." A murmur moved through the gathered crowd at his words, both Blood Moon and Thornwood representatives exchanging glances at this unexpected admission. Elena felt something ease slightly in her chest, though she remained cautious, unwilling to fully trust this apparent shift until she understood its full scope and sincerity. "I've spent months investigating what actually happened that night," Cade continued, his gaze steady despite the difficulty of the admission he was making publicly. "I spoke with pack members who witnessed the confrontation, examined the pattern of accusations Ivy has made against you over the years, and found, with considerable shame, that I failed you repeatedly, choosing comfortable assumptions over difficult truths. Do you have proof of this pattern?" Damien asked, his voice carrying quiet authority as he stepped forward slightly, his presence beside Elena a clear signal of his own investment in the proceedings. "I do," Cade said, gesturing to one of the delegates who stepped forward carrying a bound collection of testimonies. Statements from pack members who witnessed inconsistencies in Ivy's accounts over the years, evidence of manufactured conflicts, patterns of manipulation that I should have recognized far earlier than I did. Elena stepped forward to examine the documents, her hands steady despite the emotion churning beneath her composed exterior. She recognized several names among the testimonies, pack members who had watched her endure Ivy's manipulations for years without speaking up, finally offering their observations now that the consequences of continued silence had grown too significant to ignore. "Why now?" Elena asked, looking up from the documents to meet Cade's gaze directly. "Why did it take my leaving, my finding shelter within a rival kingdom, before you were willing to seek this truth?" The question landed heavily, and Cade absorbed it without flinching, understanding that he owed her complete honesty, regardless of how uncomfortable that honesty might prove. "I don't have a satisfying answer," he admitted. "I think I found it easier to believe simple explanations, to trust the person whose vulnerability demanded less scrutiny than your quiet strength. I failed to recognize that your steadiness wasn't evidence of guilt, but evidence of years spent absorbing unfair treatment without complaint. I'm ashamed of how long it took me to see that clearly." Elena felt tears threaten, though she held them back, unwilling to let this moment become about comforting Cade's guilt, rather than addressing the fuller truth of what needed to be resolved. "Your shame doesn't undo 3 years of accumulated harm," she said carefully. "It doesn't erase the moment you struck me in front of our entire pack, based on an accusation you never bothered to verify." "I know," Cade said quietly. "I'm not here asking you to forgive that, or to return to a life you've clearly built something better beyond. I'm here because Thornwood owes you a public acknowledgement of the truth, regardless of what you choose to do with that acknowledgement going forward." Elena considered his words carefully, feeling the weight of months of careful healing settling into place alongside this unexpected reckoning. She had not anticipated Cade arriving with genuine accountability rather than continued denial or demand, and the shift required her to reconsider, at least partially, the narrative she had constructed about her former mate over these preceding months. "I appreciate this honesty," she said finally. "But accountability requires more than words alone. What do you intend to do about Ivy, now that you understand the pattern she's maintained?" Cade's expression grew heavier at this question, clearly having anticipated its arrival, but finding no comfort in confronting it directly. "I've begun removing her from positions of influence within pack governance," he said. "Grandmother Wren and the other elders have supported this shift, though Ivy herself remains, for now, unaware of the full extent of what we've uncovered." "She won't accept that quietly," Elena warned. "Whatever plan you're implementing, be prepared for her to resist it with whatever manipulation remains available to her." As if summoned by the conversation itself, a commotion arose near the edge of the gathered crowd, and Elena felt her stomach drop as she recognized her sister's voice rising above the general murmur, sharp with practiced distress. Ivy had apparently insisted on accompanying the delegation despite Cade's efforts to leave her behind, and now pushed her way through the crowd toward the front of the gathering, her expression carrying none of its usual practiced vulnerability, replaced instead by open, unguarded fury. "Elena," Ivy said, her voice carrying across the crowd with theatrical distress that fooled no one present familiar with the fuller context now circulating through both territories. "How could you spread these lies about me? After everything our family has endured, how could you turn our own pack against me?" "I haven't spread anything, Ivy," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the confrontation she had known, on some level, would eventually arrive. Cade uncovered the truth on his own, through careful investigation of a pattern that existed for years before I ever left Thornwood territory. "Lies," Ivy insisted, though something in her voice carried an edge of genuine desperation now, the confident manipulation that had once served her so effectively, beginning to crack under the weight of public scrutiny she couldn't easily redirect. "You've always been jealous of the attention I received. This is simply your latest attempt to diminish me." "Ivy," Cade said, his voice carrying an authority Elena hadn't heard from him during their years together, a weariness that suggested he had exhausted whatever patience, once allowed her manipulations to continue unchecked. "I have testimonies from a dozen pack members confirming the pattern. This isn't Elena's manufactured accusation. This is documented truth I should have recognized years ago." Ivy's composure cracked further at his words, her carefully maintained performance of wounded innocence giving way, briefly, to something rawer and more genuine, a flash of calculation, as she recognized the ground shifting beneath her position more decisively than she had anticipated. "You would believe strangers' testimonies over my own account," she demanded, "after everything I've meant to you these past months?" "I would believe evidence over assumption," Cade said simply, "something I should have practiced far earlier in my leadership." The gathered crowd watched this exchange with rapt attention, and Elena felt something settle within her chest as she witnessed her sister's careful manipulations finally beginning to unravel, in full public view, exposed not through her own accusation, but through the accumulated weight of truth that patience and genuine investigation had finally brought to light. She felt no particular satisfaction in this unraveling, only a quiet, sober recognition that consequences had finally arrived for a pattern that had caused genuine harm for far too long. The days following Cade's visit to Blood Moon territory brought a fragile, uneasy peace, punctuated by continued tension as Thornwood pack elders worked through the implications of the truths Cade's investigation had uncovered. Ivy had returned to Thornwood territory alongside the delegation, her position within pack hierarchy severely diminished but not yet entirely dismantled, and Elena found herself, despite everything, watching developments from Blood Moon with a wary attention that never fully relaxed. Grace brought word one afternoon that Ivy had requested a private audience with Grandmother Wren, ostensibly to offer a full accounting of her past behavior and seek some path toward genuine amends. Elena received this news with skepticism she made no effort to hide. "She's never sought genuine amends for anything in her life," Elena said to Damien, as they walked together through the melting spring snow surrounding the camp. "This feels like another calculation, another attempt to salvage whatever position remains available to her." "Your instincts about your sister have proven reliable throughout this entire situation," Damien said. "I don't see reason to doubt them now." His instincts proved correct within days. Grandmother Wren, despite her considerable experience navigating pack politics over decades of service, found herself outmaneuvered by Ivy's renewed manipulations, convinced that Ivy's apparent remorse, combined with promises of quiet, unassuming behavior going forward, justified allowing her to retain at least some minor position within Thornwood's governance, rather than facing complete exile from the pack. This leniency proved to be a mistake that became evident within weeks, when word reached Blood Moon territory of a series of subtle disruptions occurring along the border between the two kingdoms, disruptions that bore the careful, deniable fingerprints of deliberate sabotage rather than coincidental misfortune. Trade caravans found their routes mysteriously delayed. Minor border disputes flared unexpectedly over territory that had remained peacefully uncontested for years. Rumors began circulating among both territories, suggesting that Blood Moon intended aggressive expansion into Thornwood land, rumors that traced back, upon careful investigation, to conversations Ivy had quietly initiated with pack members, inclined toward suspicion of the fragile peace developing between the two kingdoms. "She's trying to provoke conflict," Damien said grimly, reviewing the accumulated evidence with his senior advisors one evening, Elena seated beside him as an equal participant in the discussion, rather than a mere observer. "If she can't maintain her position through manipulation of Cade directly, she'll attempt to destabilize the broader peace between our territories, hoping the resulting chaos creates opportunities she can exploit." "What does she gain from provoking war between Thornwood and Blood Moon?" Edward asked, genuinely puzzled by the strategic logic underlying Ivy's apparent actions. "Chaos creates opportunity for someone skilled at manipulation," Elena said quietly, understanding her sister's calculations with a clarity that came from years of painful familiarity. "If conflict erupts, Cade will need trusted advisors more than ever, people willing to support difficult decisions without complicated moral objections. Ivy would position herself as indispensable during crisis, rebuilding the influence she's lost during this period of peaceful scrutiny. Then, we need to expose this before it escalates further," Damien said. "Elena, would you be willing to return to Thornwood territory to help identify and confront whatever mechanism she's using to spread this disruption?" Elena considered the question carefully, recognizing both the risk and the necessity underlying his request. Returning to Thornwood territory, even temporarily, meant confronting spaces and people she had deliberately left behind, meant risking whatever fragile peace she had built for herself within Blood Moon's borders. But she also recognized that allowing Ivy's manipulations to continue unchecked, potentially provoking genuine conflict between two kingdoms and countless innocent people caught in the resulting harm, represented a far greater cost than her own personal discomfort. "I'll go," she said, "but I want to approach this carefully, gathering clear evidence rather than confronting her directly without proof that would hold up under scrutiny from Thornwood's own elders." The plan that developed over the following days involved careful coordination between Blood Moon's intelligence network and Thornwood's own investigative resources, Cade proving genuinely cooperative once he understood the full scope of what his sister-in-law's continued presence within pack governance risked unleashing. Grandmother Wren, Recognizing her own error in judgment regarding Ivy's supposed remorse, threw her considerable influence behind the investigation, determined to correct her earlier misplaced leniency. Elena traveled to Thornwood territory alongside a small Blood Moon delegation, careful protocols established to ensure her safety and clear diplomatic standing throughout the visit. Walking once again through the familiar halls of her former home stirred complicated emotions she hadn't fully anticipated, memories both painful and, surprisingly, occasionally fond surfacing as she moved through spaces she had once believed constituted her entire world. The investigation proceeded methodically over several days, Elena's intimate knowledge of Ivy's patterns proving invaluable in identifying the specific channels through which her sister had spread disruption along the border. They discovered, eventually, a network of quiet bribes and manufactured misinformation that Ivy had constructed carefully over the preceding weeks, exploiting relationships and small vulnerabilities she had cultivated during her years of privileged position within pack hierarchy. The confrontation, when it finally came, occurred in the same great hall where Elena's world had shattered so many months earlier, though the circumstances now bore little resemblance to that painful evening. Ivy stood before an assembly of pack elders, Cade, and representatives from Blood Moon territory, the accumulated evidence of her sabotage laid out clearly before the gathered witnesses. "You've manufactured conflict between two kingdoms for your own personal advantage," Cade said, his voice carrying none of the affection or misplaced trust that had once colored his interactions with Ivy. "You've risked genuine harm to countless innocent people, all to salvage a position you lost through your own choices." Ivy's composure, already weakened by months of diminished standing, finally shattered entirely under the weight of undeniable evidence. Gone was the practiced vulnerability, the careful tears that had once redirected consequences away from her actions so effectively. What remained was something rawer, angrier, stripped of pretense, in a way that finally revealed the full scope of the manipulation she had maintained for years. "None of this would have been necessary if Elena hadn't run to our enemies," Ivy spat, abandoning entirely the performance she could no longer sustain. "She had everything, and she threw it away, and somehow, I'm the one facing consequences." "You struck first, Ivy," Elena said quietly, stepping forward to address her sister directly, for the first time since the confrontation that had originally driven her away. "You manufactured lies for years, sacrificed my well-being repeatedly for your own advantage. And when consequences finally began catching up to those choices, you tried to provoke war between two kingdoms, rather than accept accountability for your own actions. What do you want from me?" Ivy demanded, her voice carrying genuine desperation now, the reality of her situation finally settling in fully. "An apology? Do you want me to grovel before everyone here?" "I don't need your apology," Elena said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that this was genuinely true. "I've moved beyond needing anything from you at all. What I need is for you to face genuine consequences for actions that have caused real harm to real people, consequences that Thornwood's leniency has allowed you to avoid for far too long." The elders, having reviewed the accumulated evidence thoroughly, reached their decision with a swiftness that reflected the seriousness of Ivy's actions. Exile, effective immediately, from Thornwood territory, with formal notice sent to neighboring kingdoms, warning against extending her the kind of trust and privilege she had so thoroughly abused within her own pack. Ivy's protests, her attempts to negotiate lesser consequences or delay the ruling, found no purchase among elders, who had finally, decisively, chosen documented truth over practiced manipulation. As Ivy was escorted from the Great Hall, her final furious glance toward Elena, carrying none of the false vulnerability she had weaponized for so many years, only raw, unguarded resentment, Elena felt something complicated settle within her chest. Not triumph exactly, and not simple satisfaction, but a quiet, sober recognition that justice, however delayed, had finally caught up with actions that had caused genuine harm for far too long. She thought, briefly, of the girl she had once been, absorbing blame for crimes she hadn't committed, sacrificing her own well-being to accommodate a sister who had never once extended the same consideration in return, and felt, finally, that some essential balance had been restored, even if the cost of reaching this moment had proven far higher than anyone should have had to pay. Spring had fully arrived by the time Blood Moon territory began preparations for the coronation, the last traces of winter snow melting away from the hills surrounding the camp, replaced by the first green shoots of new growth pushing up through soil that had lain dormant through the colder months. Elena stood at the entrance of the tent that had once served as her recovery space, now transformed for this significant morning into a space filled with careful preparations for the ceremony ahead, and found herself reflecting on the remarkable distance she had traveled since first collapsing near Blood Moon's border, wounded and uncertain, so many months earlier. Grace moved around her with practiced efficiency, adjusting the fine ceremonial garments that had been prepared for this occasion, garments that bore little resemblance to anything Elena had worn during her years within Thornwood territory. Where Thornwood's ceremonial dress had always carried a certain rigid formality, an emphasis on status and hierarchy communicated through elaborate ornamentation, Blood Moon's traditions favored simpler elegance, fabric that moved naturally with the body, rather than constraining it, colors that echoed the natural world surrounding their territory, rather than announcing wealth through excess. "You look every bit the queen you're about to become," Grace said, stepping back to survey her work with evident satisfaction. Elena studied her own reflection in the polished metal mirror, positioned near the tent's entrance, taking in the woman staring back at her with something like wonder. She recognized herself, certainly, in the familiar features, the dark hair, the eyes that had witnessed so much difficulty and, ultimately, so much genuine healing over the preceding months. But something in her bearing had shifted fundamentally, from the woman who had once diminished herself to accommodate Cade's blindness and Ivy's manipulations. She stood taller now, carried herself with quiet confidence rather than careful defensive caution, and the transformation felt, in this moment, both remarkable and entirely earned. "I keep thinking about how different this feels from my first bonding ceremony," Elena admitted, as Grace made final adjustments to the delicate silver circlet that would mark her transition into Blood Moon's royal hierarchy. "That day I felt grateful, certainly, but also uncertain, aware even then of small compromises I was already learning to make to fit into Thornwood's expectations. Today feels entirely different. Because this time, you're not compromising yourself to fit someone else's vision of who you should be," Grace said simply. "You're stepping into a partnership that values exactly who you already are." The observation struck Elena with its simple truth, and she felt tears threaten, though these carried only genuine joy, none of the complicated grief that had marked so many of her earlier emotional moments throughout this long journey. She thought of the months of careful healing, of Damien's consistent patience, of the genuine friendships she had built within Blood Moon's camp, of the strength she had rediscovered within herself, once freed from the constant pressure of accommodating others' convenient blindness. Outside the tent, the sounds of Blood Moon's gathered pack members carried on the spring air, voices rising in anticipation of the ceremony about to unfold. Elena took a final steadying breath, meeting her own gaze in the mirror one last time, before stepping out to join the procession that would carry her toward this next significant chapter of her life. Damien waited for her at the ceremonial platform constructed at the heart of Blood Moon's camp, dressed in formal attire that carried the same understated elegance as her own garments, his expression carrying a mixture of solemnity and barely contained joy as he watched her approach. Around the platform, Blood Moon's entire pack had gathered, faces familiar now after months of shared life within this territory, expressions carrying genuine warmth and anticipation rather than the careful, calculating curiosity she remembered from Thornwood gatherings. She noticed, as she moved through the crowd toward the platform, a small delegation from Thornwood territory standing near the edges of the gathering, sent by Cade as a gesture of goodwill following the resolution of Ivy's exile and the careful rebuilding of trust between the two kingdoms over recent months. Grandmother Wren stood among them, her weathered face carrying genuine pride as she watched Elena's approach, a silent acknowledgement of how far this journey had carried them both from that painful night in Thornwood's own great hall. Elena reached the platform and turned to face Damien fully, the ceremonial officiant beginning the ancient words that would formally bind them as partners in leadership over Blood Moon territory. The words carried weight, distinct from the bonding ceremony she remembered from her years with Cade, less about claiming ownership, and more about mutual commitment, equal partnership rather than hierarchy, a vision of leadership built on genuine collaboration rather than one party's convenience alone. Do you, Elena Voss, choose to stand beside Damian Rourke as his equal partner in leadership, offering your voice, your wisdom, and your genuine care toward the well-being of Blood Moon territory and all who call it home? The officiant asked. I choose this, Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, steady with certainty she had earned through months of genuine healing rather than desperate need. Freely, and with full understanding of what this partnership asks of me. Do you, Damian Rourke, choose to stand beside Elena Voss as your equal partner in leadership, offering your voice, your wisdom, and your genuine care toward her well-being, as fully as toward the well-being of this territory you serve? I choose this, Damian said, his voice carrying the same quiet certainty that had marked every interaction between them since that first night he had carried her, wounded and unconscious, back to his own camp, freely, and with genuine joy for whatever future we build together. The bond that formed between them as the ceremony concluded felt entirely different from anything Elena had experienced during her years with Cade. A warmth that settled into place gently, rather than the overwhelming intensity she remembered from her first bonding. This felt like coming home to something she had built deliberately, with full awareness and genuine choice, rather than something she had simply accepted without fully understanding its implications. The crowd erupted into celebration as the ceremony concluded, voices rising in genuine joy that echoed across Blood Moon's camp, and Elena found herself swept into a whirlwind of congratulations, embraces from pack members who had become genuine friends over the preceding months, warm wishes from Grace and Edward, and countless others who had watched her transformation from wounded stranger into genuinely valued queen. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Elena found a quiet moment alone with Damian near the edge of the gathering, the sounds of music and laughter carrying on the warm spring air behind them. I keep thinking about that night I collapsed near your border, Elena said softly, watching the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky above them. If your patrol hadn't found me when they did, if you hadn't chosen to bring me back yourself rather than leaving it to others, none of this would exist. This entire life I've built here. I think about that too, Damian admitted, though I've come to believe you would have found your way to becoming exactly who you are now, regardless of the specific path that carried you here. Your strength was always there, Elena. Thornwood simply never gave you space to fully express it. Elena considered his words, recognizing their truth, even as she remained grateful for the specific circumstances that had ultimately carried her toward this moment. Perhaps, she said, but I'm grateful, regardless, that the path led here, to you, to this life I never could have imagined for myself during those years I spent making myself smaller to accommodate other people's convenience. And I'm grateful, Damian said, drawing her closer as the celebration continued around them, that whatever brought you to my border that night, it led to this partnership, this life we're building together, founded on genuine respect rather than convenient assumption. They stood together as the stars fully emerged overhead, the sounds of celebration continuing around them, marking not simply the formal beginning of Elena's role as Blood Moon's Luna Queen, but the fuller completion of a journey that had carried her from a single devastating moment of betrayal toward a genuine, hard-won peace she had built deliberately, piece by piece, through months of careful healing and authentic connection. News of the coronation eventually reached every corner of both territories, carried by traders and travelers who marveled at the unlikely alliance now binding two kingdoms that had maintained careful distance for generations. Thornwood, under Cade's continued leadership, began the slow work of rebuilding trust, not simply with Blood Moon, but within its own pack structure, implementing new systems designed to ensure that voices like Elena's would never again be so easily dismissed in favor of convenient manipulation. For Elena, the months that followed her coronation brought a settled contentment she had once believed impossible to achieve, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, a role within Blood Moon's governance that valued her insight and her voice, as fully as it valued Damian's own leadership. She thought, occasionally, of the woman who had once absorbed Cade's dismissal without protest, who had made herself smaller and smaller to accommodate a sister's manipulations and a mate's convenient blindness. and felt genuine gratitude for the journey that had ultimately carried her so far beyond that diminished existence. She had walked away from a kingdom that struck her down for tears that were never truly hers to answer for, and found, in the unlikeliest of places, a genuine home built on truths that never required her to shrink herself to fit someone else's comfort. She stood now as Luna Queen of a kingdom that had once been called enemy territory, and understood, with complete certainty, that she had never truly belonged to Thornwood at all. She had simply been waiting, all along, to find the place and the partnership that finally recognized her full worth. And in Blood Moon territory, beside a king who had chosen her freely and completely, she had finally, genuinely, found exactly that.